Welcome to Litigation Nation. I'm your host, Tanasa Watkins, here with my co-host, Jack Sanker. As a reminder, Jack and I are litigation attorneys practicing here in Chicago, and on this show, we are covering some of the latest developments in legal news from across the country. Frankly, anything that catches our attention or that you all let us know you want us to cover. So what are we covering today, Jack?
So there's a bombshell expose from ProPublica, which was published jointly with The New Yorker, on the widespread contamination in the environment and really the entire world, which we'll talk about with quote-unquote forever chemicals, how that might affect a few of America's largest companies, and what business leaders and risk managers need to be thinking about as different regulatory changes are being rolled out.
All right, and I'm going to discuss some of the latest legal troubles for OpenAI, which is the creator of ChatGPT. This is including the alleged use of Scarlett Johansson's voice in its new AI assistant technology, as well as some copyright infringement claims that have been filed by a number of authors, including George R.R. Martin, after ChatGPT was used to create the final 2 installments of the Game of Thrones book series.
Oh my God.
Yeah, very interesting. So all that and more, here's what you need to know.
In a joint report that was published by ProPublica and The New Yorker this past Monday titled Toxic Gaslighting, How 3M Executives Convinced a Scientist the Forever Chemicals She Found in Human Blood Were Safe. This story follows a chemist named Chris Hansen, who was employed by the Minnesota-based 3M for over 20 years. Kind of details her discoveries around certain chemicals that have found their way first into many streams of commerce that 3M operates in, then into our environment, and finally into the bloodstream and tissues of basically every person alive on the planet at this point. And for anyone at home who's wondering, like, have I been exposed to it? The answer is probably yes. PFAS, and this is according to the Department of Health website from Wisconsin, which our firm is active in. PFAS are found in cleaning products, obviously, water-resistant fabrics such as rain jackets, umbrellas, and tents, grease-resistant paper, which is very interesting because that specifically is I know from a little bit of experience, that refers to, like, think of like the paper that your burger from McDonald's gets wrapped in. That's a big issue, and that's been in circulation since the 50s. Like that, it's one of the reasons why you can wrap a burger in like that wax paper and it doesn't get soggy. Non-stick cookware, that's also mentioned in the piece. It was or is well, no longer is, but was being used in Teflon, which was being manufactured by DuPont, and I do believe DuPont got sued separately for that. Personal care products, shampoo, dental floss, nail polish, eye makeup, stain-resistant coatings used on carpets, upholstery, other fabrics, paints, I believe. According to the Department of Health in Wisconsin, how can I be exposed to PFAS? The main way people can be exposed to PFAS include drinking water, contaminated municipal or private well water, and that, put a pin in that because it's not like someone is dumping PFAS into the water. This is chemicals that are added to these products and then leach off of the products into the groundwater that way. So it's not like someone is, we're not saying 3M or someone else is dumping this stuff into, the well water, but all of the, nail polish and nonstick cookware and all those things, it eventually comes off those things into the groundwater. You drink it. That is also going to include, like, maybe you don't drink it and you take a shower, and that steam that you breathe in, you've also been exposed that way. Eating fish with high levels of PFAS. And as we've talked about, seemingly everything has this stuff. It seems like the freshwater fish in Minnesota, probably not great. Food grown or raised near places that used or made PFAS. Sorry, Minnesota. Packaged materials. This is like, again, the paper that's used in like your Amazon boxes, things like that. Tape. Mm-hmm. Contaminated soil or dust, so that's going to be on everything. And then other things like, I don't know why it lists ski wax and things like that. So to answer the question I started this with, if you think you have been exposed to it, it's because without a doubt you have been. Now, Hansen worked for 3M starting in the mid-90s as a chemist. For some context, 3M, the company, makes basically everything: Post-it notes, Scotch tape, the N95 masks that were so important during COVID, waterproofing sprays for fabric and leather, insulation, and so on. They're a massive company with a market cap as of today of about $55 billion. It's also probably on the brink of bankruptcy, according to a couple of financial and legal analysts, in part because of its role in spreading these forever chemicals into the environment, which we're about to discuss at length, allegedly. So back to the story. Chris Hansen, the kind of protagonist of this story and the chemist with 3M, was asked one day in 1997 to do something a little different from her day-to-day operations, to test human blood, specifically blood collected from 3M factory workers for the presence of fluorochemicals, or PFOS, which is short for perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. I'm not going to try to say that again. I'm going to say fluorochemicals, or PFOS, for the remainder of this. Anyways, many 3M products contain these fluorochemicals. And what's interesting here is that, as you find out as you read the article, and if you've been paying attention to this, it was already known at this point, even in 1997, that fluorochemicals would often show up in the blood work of 3M factory workers. Chris was being asked with comparing those samples against random samples collected by the American Red Cross. Now, what's really, really interesting is Chris Hansen found that both the 3M employee samples and the random samples from the general population contained fluorochemicals. And the piece goes on to detail how Hansen and 3M first assumed that this has got to be some kind of mistake, and all the ways in which they repeated the tests over and over again and getting the same results, because, theoretically, it makes sense for the 3M employees to have higher exposure to these chemicals, but what are they doing showing up in the bloodstream of everyday people? Eventually, Hansen told her bosses at 3M that there was seemingly fluorochemicals present in everyone's blood, at least according to her tests. Now, the boss's management at 3M, according to the piece, basically tried to get Hansen to recant her research and questioned her methodology, undermine her, and so on. Hansen and her team ordered fresh samples from every supplier that 3M worked with, and each of the samples tested positive for PFOS. Now, the piece reveals that 3M had likely known about this for some time. Quoting from the piece, quote, what Hansen didn't know was that 3M had already conducted animal studies 2 decades earlier. And remember, this is in 1997, so they're talking about the late 70s at this point. They had shown PFOS to be toxic, yet the results remained secret even to many at the company. In one early experiment conducted in the late 70s, a group of 3M scientists fed PFOS to rats on a daily basis. Starting at the second lowest dose that the scientists tested, about 10 milligrams for every kilogram of body weight, the rats showed signs of possible harm to their livers, and half of them died. At higher doses, every rat died. Soon afterward, 3M scientists found that a relatively low dose, 4.5 milligrams for every kilogram of body weight, could kill a monkey within weeks. Based on this result, the chemical would currently fall in the highest of 5 toxicity levels recognized by the United Nations. This daily dose of PFOS was orders of magnitudes greater than the amount that the average person would ingest, but it was still relatively low, roughly comparable to the dose of aspirin in a standard tablet. Now, in 1979, an internal company report deemed PFOS, quote, certainly more toxic than anticipated, and recommended longer-term studies. That year, 3M executives flew to San Francisco to consult with Harold Hodge, a respected toxicologist. They told Hodge only part of what they knew, that PFOS had sickened and even killed laboratory animals and had caused liver abnormalities in factory workers, according to a 3M document that was marked confidential. Hodge urged the executives to study whether the company's fluorochemicals caused reproductive issues or cancer. After reviewing more data, he told one of them to find out whether the chemicals were present in man. And he added, quote, if the levels are high and widespread and the half-life is long, we could have a serious problem, unquote. Yet Hodge's warning was omitted from the official meeting notes, and the company's fluorochemical production actually increased over time, unquote. So Hansen tests showed fluorochemicals in local farm animals and wildlife, lab rats, fish, so on. Some female animals would kind of unexpectedly show a decrease in fluorochemicals, and the explanation for that, it turns out, is kind of Depressing because Hansen discovered that those animals were likely offloading their own fluorochemicals into their offspring when they gave birth. So pregnant mammals were giving birth to offspring that also tested positive for fluorochemicals without having actually been exposed to them yet. This part gets interesting. Quoting from the piece again, quote, Hansen knew that if she could find a blood sample that didn't contain PFOS, then she might be able to convince her colleagues that the other samples did. And parenthetical, because at this point they still didn't believe her, right? Going back to it, she and her team began to study historical blood from the early decades of PFOS production. They soon found the chemical in blood from a 1969 or 1971 Michigan breast cancer study. They then ran an overnight test on the blood that had been collected in rural China in the 1980s and 1990s. And if any place were PFOS free, she figured, it would have been somewhere remote where 3M products weren't in widespread use. The next morning, anxious to see the results, Hansen arrived at the lab before anyone else. For the first time since she had begun blood testing, some of the samples showed no trace of PFOS. She was so struck that she called her husband. There was nothing wrong with her equipment or her methodology. PFOS, a man-made chemical produced by her employer, really was in human blood, practically everywhere. Hansen's team found it in Swedish blood samples from 1957 and 1971. After that, her lab analyzed blood that had been collected before 3M created PFOS, and it tested negative. Apparently, fluorochemicals had entered human blood after the company started selling products that contained them. They had leached out of 3M sprays, coatings, and factories and into all of us, unquote. So it's a correlation versus causation thing here, but there's a point in time in which none of the testing is indicating any fluorochemicals in anyone's blood. The chemicals get introduced into the larger stream of commerce, and now you really can't find blood samples that do not contain them. And I should note that 3M is the inventor and primary producer of these chemicals during this time period. I also don't want to gloss over the rest of the story about Chris Hansen because it's really a good read and kind of tragic. And she gets harassed, and her career is sidelined according to the piece, of course. But that's a bit outside the scope of this show. I do highly recommend that anyone who's interested go read the article. It's really well done. She also ends up testing her own blood when she was pregnant with twins. And sure enough, she was positive for fluorochemicals, but had an extremely low count, which she thought and understandably believes meant that she had offloaded the chemicals that were in her body into her unborn twins at this point in utero. But I do want to stick to the kind of the legal, business, and societal angles of this story. Some more info on that. In 2002, 3M announced it would be replacing its primary commercial fluorochemical PFOS with another one called PFBS. Then in 2006, the EPA accused 3M of violating the Toxic Substances Control Act, and 3M paid a fine without admitting any wrongdoing. Eventually, fluorochemicals and other similar similar chemicals. Don't ask me to comment on the chemistry of all this. I was a history major, turned commercial litigator. I'm not some kind of dork chemist.
Yeah, psychology. I've got nothing for you there.
Yeah, I'm joking about that. My wife's a doctor and she listens to the show sometimes. So,
thanks for your support.
Yeah. This show is actually, or this story rather, has been dramatized in the 2016 movie Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo, if anyone's seen that, which I haven't seen, but this actually does remind me a bit more of Michael Clayton, which is a great lawyer movie if you haven't seen that. Mm-hmm. Not implying that 3M has had anyone assassinated, which happens in that movie, but, it's a good movie. Anyways, the term that's being thrown about now, PFAS or PFAS, which includes PFOS, fluorochemicals, and if you look around, if you Google PFAS, you'll see that they are basically being found in everything from baby diapers to food packaging to industrial chemicals. Going back to the piece, quote, between 1951 and 2000, 3M produced at least 100 million pounds of PFOS and other chemicals that degrade into PFOS. This is roughly the weight of the Titanic. After the late 70s, when 3M scientists established that the chemical was toxic in animals and was accumulating in humans, it produced millions of pounds per year. Scientists are still struggling to grasp all of the biological consequences. They have learned, just as Hansen's bosses at 3M did, decades ago that proteins in the body bind to PFOS, enters our cells and organs, where even tiny amounts can cause stress and interfere with basic biological functions. It contributes to diseases that take many years to develop, and at the time of a diagnosis, one's PFOS levels may have fallen, making it difficult to establish causation with any certainty, unquote. So these chemicals are now being linked to developmental disorders, different types of cancers, and so on. I don't want to speculate on how closely linked they are. We'll leave that to the toxic tort plaintiff lawyers. Quoting again from the piece, quote, new health effects continue to be discovered. Researchers have found that exposure to PFAS, and remember PFAS is a broader term that encapsulates fluorochemicals and PFOS. Exposure to PFAS during pregnancy can lead to developmental delays in children. Numerous recent studies have linked the chemicals to diabetes and obesity. This year, a study discovered 13 forever chemicals, including PFOS, in weeks-old fetuses from terminated pregnancies and linked the chemicals to biomarkers associated with liver problems. A team of New York University researchers estimated in 2018 that the cost of just two forever chemicals, PFOA and PFOS, in terms of disease burden, disability, healthcare expenses, amounted to as much as $62 billion in a single year. This exceeds the current market value of 3M on a per-year basis. Philippe Grandjean, a physician who helped discover that PFAS harm the immune system, believes that anyone exposed to these chemicals, which is essentially everyone, may have an elevated risk of cancer. Our immune systems often find and kill abnormal cells before they turn into tumors. Quote, PFAS interfere with the immune system and likely also this critical function, he told the author. Grandjean, who served as an expert witness in the Minnesota AG's case, as a parenthetical against 3M, has studied many environmental contaminants, including mercury. The impact of PFAS was so much more extreme, he said, that one of his colleagues initially thought it was the result of nuclear radiation, unquote. Wow. Yeah. So why are we covering this on the show? It is an interesting story. There's plenty of litigation around this already. We'll talk about in a moment. But more specifically, it's worthwhile to talk about what the different regulators are doing to address this stuff now. In April of 2024, for example, the EPA issued a few new rule changes and statements that would acknowledge that no amounts of PFAS are safe, that they are likely to cause cancer, that they are deemed hazardous chemicals under federal laws, and are subject to federal enforcement mechanisms to force polluters to clean the chemicals up. The EPA also sets limits for PFAS in drinking water. Now, local utilities will be forced by law to test for PFAS in water supplies starting in a few years. And you can already see how this is going to affect companies and businesses, not just 3M. Anyone that uses PFAS in its products, processing, manufacturing, or putting them into streams of commerce can be caught up in these regulations. In fact, 3M just settled, I think in April of this year, a lawsuit filed by different municipalities for up to $12.5 billion. Which is to cover the costs of treating local water supplies, and in 2022 announced that it would stop making PFAS altogether. From the regulatory side of things, 34 states have introduced regulations on PFAS, 28 states have adopted some measure of regulation on the use, and importantly, for a lot of people listening, the disclosure of the use of such chemicals by really anyone doing business in those states. And from the work that I've been doing on this and my experience here, what I could tell you is that a lot of these disclosure agreements extend not only to the immediate business practice of a company that's operating in these states, but also if those businesses are importing materials or parts from somewhere else, and those materials or parts contain PFAS, any components that they're having assembled abroad and being brought into the States and then being sold, all of these things are going to be required to be disclosed. So that level of knowledge and keeping tabs on the supply chain is going to be incredibly burdensome for a lot of businesses, especially considering, how much in our kind of global commerce, how much different parts, different things are imported from abroad and then assembled here, repackaged, whatever. Minnesota, for example, has some of the strictest regulations in the country on this so far, and incidentally is the home state of 3M. Broadly speaking, the rules in Minnesota require, and I'm going to go ahead and quote from a fact sheet that's put out by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency here, quote, that a manufacturer of a product sold, offered for sale, or distributed in Minnesota, so that's manufactured, offered for sale, or distributed, that contains intentionally added PFAS must submit certain required information to the MPCA, which is the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. This rulemaking proposes to establish a program to collect information about products containing intentionally added PFAS. For any intentionally added PFAS in products or product components, the information required includes reporting of a description, numeric coding of the product, the purpose of any PFAS in the product, the identity of each PFAS present, the amount of each PFAS present, location and contact information for the manufacturer, and any additional information requested by the MPCA. The MPCA must be prepared to collect this information by January 1st, 2026. So, break that down for a moment. It's limited to the intentional addition of PFAS to products or components, things like that. It seems to be carving out an exception for unintentional contamination. If you know anything about PFAS, they show up in everything. So if there was a test that was done involving a factory worker who had used shampoo that contained PFAS and then was touching certain components, and then every single one of those components, which did not contain PFAS as part of the manufacturing process, tested positive for PFAS because of this guy's like shampoo residue, right? So they're looking for the intentional addition of PFAS to different products, things like that. But it does expand pretty significantly down the supply chain. And the information that's requested here, the purpose of any PFAS in the product, the identity of each one, the amount and location and contact information for the manufacturer. That's a lot of information to keep track of if you're just some local supplier in the United States. And think about drop shippers or the Temu salespeople that are on Instagram or whatever. They have no idea. They're just just advertising something that gets sold in the U.S. It gets shipped from China or whatever. So from talking with folks in the industry, and this is something that our office has been working on, this disclosure requirement and this tracking requirement and all that, it looks like it's going to be extremely burdensome on local business. But if you're not thinking about this, and if you are in any of these states, you really need to be, because it's already halfway through 2024. The Minnesota regulation goes into effect January 1st. The EPA regulations go into effect in 2025. There are different ones all over the different states. Illinois has one that's going into effect shortly as well. Different requirements from each. But ultimately, at some point, we expect that the federal government is going to kind of unify a federal standard here. It would be well within Congress's regulatory authority, interstate commerce, whatever, to do that. And this type of disclosure and tracking information alone is probably going to become the norm sometime before the end of the decade. It also seems like this information is going to be retrospective to a point. So you're going to and think about it, if you have a product that is being sold, it's hitting the shelves in 2027, but the components and the different parts and things like that have been sourced over the course of a couple of years, you're going to have to disclose that as well. So the amount of record keeping and the way in which you can kind of make sure that you're all kosher with these regulatory agencies, pretty serious. And the other thing is, if you are in the business of merging with or acquiring or getting acquired by any company, you're going to need to know, this is going to need to be part of your due diligence process, and it wasn't before. So on the corporate side of things, we're now seeing a ton of inquiries about, hey, I'm some local construction company. I want to buy this contractor, and they, are using, hypothetically, 3M insulation, right? What do I need to know about this? What do I need to disclose? Whatever. I'm just a small, $10 million company. So it's causing a lot of people to ask questions, which is a good thing. But it is going to shake up how business is done for a lot of people in the next couple of years. And this story that is in the New Yorker and ProPublica this week, and I'm seeing is picked up on, it's been on cable news now and everything else. PFAS and this type of, quote unquote, forever chemicals, it's been in the news for a long time. This is probably the first time that I've seen it like on the front page. With the big settlement from 3M, as I mentioned, it's $12.5 billion. 3M also has some other legal troubles around their earplugs, which I think was a $10 billion settlement, if I remember.
I think I just read it was for $6 billion.
Yeah,
So they're shelling out billions of dollars for
like
different products.
They have a market cap of $55 billion, and roughly 16 to 20 is now going to be earmarked for settlements. And this is like before, and this is not the like toxic tort litigation that I think most people think will happen. You'll have lawsuits similar to the asbestos talc litigation. That's been going on for decades. That has almost bankrupted, Johnson & Johnson several times, and has bankrupted other companies. Interestingly, the big insurance companies, to me, they're like Vegas. Like, they're never wrong about this stuff. Like, they're really great at clocking the risk, and they, this is kind of insider baseball, but a lot of the reinsurers have already written this out of their policies. So if you think that your insurance policy covers liabilities for whether it's toxic exposure for PFAS or business liabilities associated with the disclosure requirements, it probably doesn't. So if you're thinking about the contracts that you're entering into, if you're acquiring or merging or anything on those lines, you really need to be thinking hard about the risk management side of this thing and how it's going to affect you kind of down the road. So that's the story, Dennis. I mean, there's a lot going on, obviously. There's the human interest element of it all, of course, which I do think I've breezed past, and maybe we should spend a moment on that.
Well, I think it's probably yet to be seen. I mean, we do have this settlement pending. I think I saw that 3M is going to start making payments in the third quarter of this year, but it is expected to extend 2 years, where they're going to start testing water sources and see where the money needs to be allocated to clean things up. But yeah, now that, like you said, it's front page news, this is when we're going to start seeing the class action lawsuits.
Yeah, and like I said, it's going to be, you're going to have the kind of toxic tort personal injury type class actions, that are kind of omnipresent with this type of thing. But the municipality aspect of it, I think, is very interesting because cities and towns who are going to, by law, be required to test for this thing, and then by law be required to remove it from the water supply, that's not free.
Right.
And they're going to be looking for someone to contribute or to pay for that. And that's going to come down to, 3M is singled out here because that's what the article's about, but they're not the only ones, obviously. So it's like kind of looming. A lot of these companies just are going to have to deal with this. In my first experience, it was a brief experience, but my first experience out of law school was at an asbestos litigation firm. And I kind of view this as almost exactly as that. It's like, it looks exactly like that, where they kind of knew, allegedly, that it was bad and didn't do anything about it, and now it's kind of, the house of cards is coming down.
Well, and the frustrating part is, like you said, not only do the municipalities now need to probably pay for certain things, which maybe some of this settlement will cover, but I have a feeling that
it'll exceed 12.5.
Yeah, I think $12.5 billion is going to go pretty quickly. So that's probably going to come from either the government or the taxpayers ultimately.
Well, I think from part of the reason that settlement was reached, and I was keeping tabs on it was happening, was because of solvency concerns for 3M. It's like, take this money now, or take it, get in line with our other creditors.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm thinking, is at some point they're going to go bankrupt here.
Some people think, yeah.
But, I mean...
This is not financial advice.
Right, exactly. But aside from, just that, now you have these businesses that have to spend all this money in their compliance and, the things they need to do because of a company that knew for decades, allegedly, that I was selling these products. Yeah. And, now that cost is being passed on to to these businesses, unbeknownst to them that,
Yeah.
you know.
And as I understand it, 3M invented this type of product. And like there's some cool anecdotes in the story about like where these cool and you know, if we're going to defend 3M here, you know, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't, but the products that they have kind of contributed to the world are important and very interesting, and it's pretty cool. Like there's an anecdote in the story about how one of the PFAS chemicals dropped onto one of the factory workers' shoe, and then they noticed that they like couldn't get it off the shoe, and then it like coated the shoe in such a way that it was waterproof, and then they turned it into Scotchgard. Yes, that's the product, Scotchgard, which is, you know, like a leather waterproofing and fabric waterproofing material, and that's cool. And I've used that. You know, I use
Same.
Scotch tape, obviously, and we all like were clamoring for N95 masks. You know, not all that long ago, and I should note 3M does they have defended themselves on this publicly and said, you know, whatever inadvertent damage we've done. It was in service of like providing these goods and services, and you know, I don't think they say, you know, whether they should have talked about it earlier or not, but I think they do make the cost benefit case. You know, I don't know if that's compelling or not, but
I'm shaking my head over here.
Yeah, well,
just tell that to the person who has cancer, you know.
Yeah, and you know, I will say also from being around this, the reason that the toxic tort cancer lawsuits, the birth abnormality lawsuits, the renal failure stuff that hasn't sprung up yet is because the science at the individual level I don't think is there for what I've seen.
Well, it seems like it's so widespread that how do you cast out the other variables?
That's the really interesting part is that you can't find a control group. I mean, they had to go back decades in the U.S. to find anyone who was like free of this thing. There was a headline that caught my eye the other day actually on this as I was putting this article together. It was a study that was done of biopsied testicles, and every single one had it was they called them microplastics, but that would also largely be included in this. Jeez. Every single one. So, and it's in unborn fetuses. It's in everything. It's, you know, yeah, it's really strange. And there does seem to be, there's a temporal link, of course, between when the chemicals were introduced by 3M and when this stuff started showing up in everyone's bloodstream. So there's, not in this article, but there's other information about like really, really far into like sub-Saharan Africa. There's examples of people that have not been exposed, or you have to get pretty far into the unindustrialized world to find people that have been around this. But that's going to be an increasingly shrinking number.
Right. Yeah, it's almost too big to wrap your mind around, to be honest. But it's probably one of those things where the more that lawsuits get filed, it's just going to be too expensive to litigate them, and it'll just turn into settlements.
Yeah, you'd think so. But the regulatory compliance aspect of this is going to be what we kind of have our eye on here, and we may even bring on one of our partners here at the firm in the next couple of weeks by the name of Craig Kubiak, who kind of specializes in that and is working with some of these companies to get their ducks lined up in advance of all these deadlines. And also, as we know, these regulations come out, they get moved back. They can, a year or 2 years, 3 years. And the EPA at the federal level is going to be inundated with this information. It's going to take them 5 years to, if you give them the data for 2025, they will not be able to sift through it until 2030, kind of like the IRS in that regard. But you still have to do it, and like you have to make a public log of having done it. That's going to affect investor relations. That's going to affect, whether someone wants to buy your company or not. It's a big deal. So we're trying to get our heads around that here, and doing our best to help everyone out. Everyone who wants to, be good faith actors in this process.
All right. Well, pivoting away from one area of doom and gloom, and I guess entering into a scary world of artificial intelligence, I'm going to cover some recent stories and litigation and claims against OpenAI. So, this is an American artificial intelligence research organization that was founded in 2015. The company's website states, quote, "Our mission is to ensure that artificial general intelligence, AI systems that are generally smarter than humans, benefits all of humanity," end quote. OpenAI researches generative models and how to best align them with human values. So the company openly acknowledges the potential power of artificial intelligence as it employs a specialized safety systems team and dedicates a whole section of its website to discussing its safety standards and best practices for users who interact with its products. Now, OpenAI is most readily known for its ChatGPT product, which we've talked a lot about on this podcast in different areas of law and how it's used. But the company just recently expanded the capabilities of this product by introducing voice mode or voice assistance. So in May of 2024, OpenAI unveiled its voice assistant during an event in San Francisco. Mark Chen, who's the company's research lead, in a demonstration, he told the assistant that he was nervous to be doing a live demo. And then in a peppy cheerleader type voice, the assistant responded, "Oh, you're doing a live demo right now? That's awesome." And then Mr. Chen, he went through a lengthy demonstration just explaining how the product essentially combines conversational skills of the ChatGPT chat box with the sound of a voice assistant similar to like Siri on the iPhone. So in total, OpenAI has 5 voices associated with its assistant, which are all assigned kind of catchy, earthy names: Breeze, Cove, Ember, Juniper, and Sky. Not sure what the origin of those.
Okay.
Yep. Now, all of this was great until the voices went public, and one in particular, Sky, was eerily similar, if not indistinguishable, from the voice of well-known A-list actress Scarlett Johansson. So if you'll recall, in 2013, Johansson starred in the Spike Jonze movie Her, and she provided the voice of an AI system in that film. And if I remember right, I think that film was about a man who sort of secludes himself and then ends up falling in love with his virtual assistant, which is Johansson's voice.
It's a lovely movie. It sounds sad the way you just said it, but it's actually a really sweet movie, believe it or not.
I think it's supposed to, though, highlight the power and, potential issues with AI.
And in this movie, he's just like a tragic, like, emo guy.
Yeah, lonely guy who, relies on AI for, I guess, his only social interactions.
Love, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess, it's just kind of a weird situation where Scarlett Johansson was an AI voice, and now there is a voice out there that
She won an Academy Award
resembles.
for that, by the way.
Oh, did she?
She did, yeah.
Oh,
Quick producer note. She did not.
look at you.
I like the movie. What do you want to say?
I guess so. Gosh. So since that voice came out, Johansson has revealed that Sam Altman, who is the chief executive for OpenAI, that he called her agent and asked that she consider licensing her voice for a virtual assistant. And he made that request at least twice over the past year, and both times Johansson declined. So OpenAI quickly addressed Johansson's allegations, and the company actually immediately ceased using the Sky voice, but posted on its online blog over the weekend, quote, "AI voices should not deliberately mimic a celebrity's distinctive voice. Sky's voice is not an imitation of Scarlett Johansson, but belongs to a different professional actress using her own natural speaking voice," end quote. OpenAI said that it couldn't actually share the names of its voice professionals for privacy reasons, but that it had worked with directors and producers to develop these 5 voices for its products, and they were recorded last summer in San Francisco. So ultimately, OpenAI is just saying that the similarities to Ms. Johansson's voice were incidental and that the voice wasn't specifically designed to sound like that actress. So I'm just going to stop here because I do want to address just generally that the imitation of voices has become so prevalent recently across so many situations. I know we've seen fake songs come out claiming to be artists' work when it really was AI. in my
Yeah,
home.
Drake.
Yeah, Drake. That's what I was thinking
Thanks.
of. Yep.
Sacrilege. Using AI Tupac.
Yeah, exactly. And then in my home state of New Hampshire, a few months ago, voters were receiving robocalls, which sounded like President Biden telling citizens not to go out and vote in the
Oh
primaries.
my God.
So yeah, I mean the technology here, it's real, it's being used regularly, and Johansson, I think, is just one of the latest high-profile persons to accuse a company of using creative work without her permission.
And her royalties.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I mean, she is a voice actress. On top, she gets paid to do this, like a lot of money to do this.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So it financially is like she's getting ripped off.
Mm-hmm.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. Yeah. There is no lawsuit filed yet, but
There was a cease and desist, I believe.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I said, this is just one of many of OpenAI's problems that they've been facing recently. They have been hit with a litany of copyright infringement claims over the past year or so, alleging that the company is using copyrighted works to train its flagship large language model, or LLM, and that ChatGPT, its outputs improperly summarize, mimic, or reproduce copyrighted materials. So one of these class action lawsuits was brought in the Southern District of New York. It was filed in September of 2023 by the Authors Guild, which is the nation's oldest and largest organization of writers, along with 17 individually named authors, many of whom are well-known household names like John Grisham, Jodi Picoult, and George R.R. Martin. So these authors are alleging that their books were downloaded from pirate ebook repositories and then copied into the models that power ChatGPT. So OpenAI is allegedly using the authors' voices, characters, stories, etc. to train ChatGPT, which in turn allows users to create unauthorized sequels and derivatives of these copyrighted works. So the claim is that OpenAI should have first obtained a licensing agreement to use these authors' works rather than just getting them from pirated websites.
Right.
So once these are loaded into the ChatGPT model, when a user prompts it to, the system will produce an infringing and unauthorized, for example, outline of the next purported installment work for these authors. So it'll actually pull characters from these books. It also can generate low-quality ebooks impersonating the authors. So one of the plaintiffs is author Jane Friedman, and she discovered what she says, quote, a cache of garbage books, end quote, written under her name for sale on Amazon that they discovered were created by ChatGPT. So one of the questions in this lawsuit is, although certainly ChatGPT has been used to produce these infringing works, how do we know that OpenAI knowingly trained ChatGPT on these copyrighted materials? Well, the lawsuit provides a number of bases, but most notable and probably most concerning is that OpenAI has confirmed this to be true, stating that their training data is, quote, derived from existing publicly accessible corpora of data that include copyrighted works, end quote.
Right. They're broadly speaking claiming fair use here, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is their argument.
We can talk about fair use in a minute, yeah.
Well, yeah, actually, that's kind of where I was going anyways. And that is just a legal doctrine that will permit the unlicensed use of copyright-protected works in certain circumstances, like, for example, parody, comment, criticism. It kind of goes hand in hand with First Amendment rights. So that's what OpenAI is arguing, that their program's ingestion of these copyrighted works to create large language models or other AI training databases is generally fair use. So like I said, that's just one of the lawsuits that's out there right now. There are also a number of lawsuits in the Northern District of California, and these were actually brought prior to the New York lawsuits. And just recently in April, the California cases, they were trying to intervene in the New York actions for the purpose of staying those. I think the concern of the plaintiffs or the plaintiffs' counsel were that New York might be creating bad law that would harm the rights of those artists in California who are trying to bring action under California's laws. But the New York judge ended up rejecting that intervention, saying that the claims were different. For example, the New York plaintiffs had actually added Microsoft as a defendant in their case, saying that Microsoft, as an investor of OpenAI, is responsible for some of the training because it couldn't have happened without Microsoft's financial and technical support in order to train the ChatGPT model. Another thing the judge mentioned was that the whole purpose of intervening was to stay the case. So those New York plaintiffs would have to wait and see what happened in the California litigation, which just would be unfair to them. So the judge is essentially saying, let's keep these cases separate from now. You all bring your claims in California. We'll maintain ours here in New York. I'm sure there are others that have popped up, but those are definitely two of the venues that seem to be the biggest for these type of cases. So I was kind of interested in this story when I read that ChatGPT can be used to actually create full works. And George R.R. Martin is one of the plaintiffs that has fallen victim to that.
All right.
Okay, I don't need to know your thoughts on.
I mean, we've been waiting for the books.
I know.
What do you want us to do?
I know. So that's
It's been a long time.
That's what they're saying. There are so many people out there that are just sitting on the edge of their seats, and yeah.
He has been promising these books for
well,
10 years.
He's still diligently working on them. So.
All right.
But so yes, one tenacious fan said, "I'm done waiting," and actually used ChatGPT to finish the series. Obviously, in a fraction of the time of what George is taking. So I looked into that a little bit, and I found this IGN article. Independent developer Liam Swain, he actually published his project where he used ChatGPT to write the remaining two books of Song of Ice and Fire series. So he explained, went through the prompts he did. He essentially created an outline for the first chapter of one of the books and then just repeated it over and over, and then asked ChatGPT to get more detailed in the outlines. Ultimately, he came up with 45 chapters of a book. And
has anyone read it?
Yeah, so I think they've been pulled down now because of these lawsuits. But yes, they were put out there. People did access them. And so he kind of talks in this article about what he thought ChatGPT did well and what it didn't. Apparently, if anyone knows Game of Thrones, I mean, I did the audiobooks. I started to listen to him on audio, and then I watched the series, and then the audio fell off.
Show's better.
But I just can't even imagine reading the book and trying to keep up with characters. I would probably have to have side notes going, because it'll be a couple hundred pages before a character pops up again, and in that time you forget. Well, apparently ChatGPT does not forget, and it was very good at tracking character continuity. Would have characters, disappear. It actually says for hundreds of thousands of words before a character would return to a scene and, pick up exactly how you knew that character before. So that was kind of interesting. But this guy said that what ChatGPT is not good at is Martin's best trick of killing off characters in surprising ways. So those type of plot twists, there just isn't enough examples of that out there. So, ChatGPT doesn't have all of that data that would, I guess, teach it to do those type of sporadic killings.
To be creative.
Yeah, essentially to be an author. So that was certainly lacking, and so this guy says, AI is not going to replace authors anytime soon, but still, that's not a reason to not protect their works, especially when these books are being put out under their names,
Yeah, and as not an intellectual property attorney, but I took one class in law school. But as I understand, fair use allows you to use copyrighted materials for certain instances, like educational purposes, critical review, things like that. One thing that is a big no-no is using copyrighted materials for commercial purposes. Mm-hmm. So if something you're going to use it to make money off of, right? ChatGPT has a free version, has a paid version, but it is ultimately a paid company. Mm-hmm. And it is just consuming copyrighted materials to spit out I would say even the end product is itself is maybe not even the infringement so much as the infringement is the creation of the algorithm. The algorithm is the infringement,
Right.
Or artificial intelligence, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Even feeding that copyrighted material to the program so that it can work off of it.
Right, without license.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
is infringement on these folks' copyrights, because what it does is it spits out an amalgamation of like what it is legal to do is write like fan fiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that would be legal to say like I wrote my own take on the Game of Thrones books.
Yeah.
That's fine. It's not fine if you're commercializing that through ripping off copyrighted materials to do so, as I understand it.
Yeah. Creating like they call them derivative works,
Right.
essentially.
Yeah, and it gets even worse when you like falsely attribute it to the author.
Well, yeah, that's certainly the most egregious. But yeah, even using George R. R. Martin's other books, having the same characters, the same plot lines and all that, and then coming out with these books. I mean, does that hurt his future sales? Because now fans have already, all right, we got our fix.
Yeah. And I should take that back, actually. I actually do think if you like write a book and you're like, this is my take on Game of Thrones, and you're using the same characters and like whatever, I think that actually is infringement.
I think you might be right, yeah.
I think that the authors are like okay with it if you're like publishing it on Tumblr versus selling it as an ebook.
Right, absolutely. Another lawsuit that's been brought at New York is actually by New York Times. So ChatGPT somehow got into a database of a bunch of old New York Times articles, and then it's been spitting those out in different ways. So as much as you would think the news is free and anyone can access it, well, sure, if it's published by New York Times,
and it's not free. Like there's a paywall.
That's true. Yeah. So and that goes back decades. I mean, their lawsuit is pretty big with that. I think I don't think they actually joined that case with the one by the Authors Guild, but I think the same judge is overseeing them, which makes sense. So 'cause they're definitely related. So these are in the early stages. I think one case is hearing motion to dismiss arguments soon. One of the New York cases is just going into preliminary discovery. So there's a lot to be seen. Obviously, OpenAI is going to protect ChatGPT as much as it can. It needs access to all of this information in order to do what it does. So
and it can't. Its business model probably can't sustain licensing this stuff, right?
Oh yeah, I mean I can't even imagine what the costs involved would be.
Right. That's the whole point.
Mm-hmm. For sure, and I'm sure there are people that will say no.
Yeah, I was glancing around before coming here to record, and there are scholarly articles that have been written in Law Review. I don't know how I can't vouch for the credibility of the authors or the Law Review, and I didn't really spend much time reading it. But there are people that are claiming it is fair use. Mm-hmm. So it will have to be decided. Ultimately, if it is fair use, though, that's probably the end of many copyright protections for people, because this AI stuff will just gobble it all up,
Yeah, it's definitely, there's going to be some interesting law set from these cases if they don't end up just settling. But I think the interest at stake, unless discovery starts to go a certain way, are so important that probably these companies, including Microsoft, now that Microsoft is a named defendant, that ups the stakes as well. They may want to get some rulings, potentially.
Going back to Scarlett Johansson, did you see the tweet that Sam Altman put out regarding this? When they demoed the voice assistant, it was Sky, which is the one that sounds like Scarlett Johansson. Everyone was like, sounds exactly like Scarlett Johansson, and it's very obviously an homage, at the very least, to her role in the movie Her. Mm-hmm. And he just tweeted the word her.
Yeah, I did see that.
Oh yeah, just admit to it, dude. Why not?
Right. Now I know.
Why do that? That I'm sure that their legal was
move.
delete that.
Yeah, I can't say that I envy his lawyers. That was.
Well, it is an example. We've talked about this with respect to Facebook's kind of a company like Facebook, a company like Uber, that have, and that whole move fast and break things ethos from the mid 2000s of like, this may or may not be legal. It's, we'll call it in a gray area for now. But let's get into that space as quickly as we can because regulators don't understand it.
Yep.
And establish ourselves and then raise as much money around it as possible. And then, regulators will be forced with, the choice of dismantling a multi-billion-dollar enterprise or bending the rules. And that is at least somewhat an effective business model. We'll call that regulatory arbitrage for like a company like Uber that, at the outset was like, we're not a taxi cab company. We're, something else. We're a dispatch company.
Yeah.
And so we don't have to have workers' comp insurance.
Right.
And regulators are like, we don't know what you are because we're 80, and they've more or less weathered the storm and have avoided what I think at the outset was probably pretty condemning legal arguments. And now we've bent those rules in their favor, and for good or for bad.
And that's also the varied state to state, sometimes city to city, which now kind of when you use that analogy, now I can kind of see why the plaintiffs in California wanted to intervene in the New York case.
Sure.
Because artists aren't stationary, they travel, and they want to make sure that their rights are protected across the country.
And the larger context, if any of you all remember the Screen Actors Guild strike from less than a year ago, one of the sticking points of the big studios and a lot of the streaming services was we want to retain rights to your name, image, and likeness for use in subsequent things. So if you want to, in the big shots, the A-listers, things like that, someone like Scarlett Johansson, have a lot more leverage there. But if you're a working actor who is an extra or has speaking parts in a TV show or whatever, that would have had to have been something you signed on to as part of the new renegotiation of these streaming deals, where they could just, you could come on, do your thing, they pay you once, and then they can just simulate your voice and image via AI forever, and you get none of those residuals. There's a Black Mirror episode about this too, actually.
There's a Black Mirror episode about everything scary that happens.
Salma Hayek. It's a great episode.
No, I actually, a couple months ago, I met the attorney that was involved in the negotiations on behalf of the actors, and she was, there's a lot she couldn't talk about, but that was one of the big issues that came up was that, actors, they would be required to do these, body screens.
Yeah. Which,
okay, from, let's say that these production companies aren't all bad, and, they're shooting, and then they months after the fact realize, we need to, the story doesn't make sense. We need to add in this one extra scene with this actor doing this. And what are they going to do? Pay that person $1 million to fly out for, 30 minutes of no.
That's what they used to do.
Right.
Yeah.
That's it. But now they're like, no, now we have their digital replica, so they can just add in that scene. They don't have to pay, whatever fees that person would charge for coming out for a day.
Yeah, I mean, even going back further, I mean, one of the reasons why there was there's the NIL deals and collegiate athletics is because this I think goes back 10 years, but EA Sports, which makes NCAA football, whatever, was doing this with college athletes, and it was we're going to make the digital stand-in of Tim Tebow, and that person is going to be on NCAA 2006. And eventually they're like, no, you can't do that. That's, that person who's number 15 for the Florida Gators is clearly Tim Tebow. He looks exactly like him. There's no name on him, but that's who you're emulating here. And that's who you're using to sell this game. You have some rights to that. And that's kind of what started the ability of these athletes now to sell their name, image, and likeness, NIL, and get themselves some money while they're in college and everything else. And this is kind of trying to reverse engineer that, it seems like.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, it depends on the bargaining power. I mean, that was the idea, is that we need to make it so that these actors can have some power, and it's not just, you automatically need to sign away your rights or you're not in this film.
Yeah.
Because, I get it. I don't think you need to be a bomb shelter person to be concerned about having someone have your name and likeness to, even though they say we're only going to use it for this film. How do you know that? So I get it. I understand we want to use technology to our advantage, but it's concerning.
Lest you despair and are worried again about AI, gobbling up your jobs and everything else, I will share a personal anecdote that if you just kind of playing around with ChatGPT, and I saw people doing this online, so this wasn't my idea, but just so everyone understands like the level of where AI is at this point. And I posted this to my LinkedIn if anyone needs proof of this interaction. But I asked ChatGPT if they'd like to play a game of rock, paper, scissors with me, and I said, you start. And ChatGPT says, sure, I'll start. I choose rock. What's your move? My response, paper. ChatGPT, paper covers rock. Nicely done. You win this round. Ready for the next one? I say, yeah, go ahead.
Oh
ChatGPT says, all right, here we go. This time I choose scissors. What's your move? I say rock. Congratulations, I've won again. So I have a 100% win rate against ChatGPT, and that is kind of, I'm sure that people that are in this space are probably fuming that no, that it's better than that, and you rigged the game, whatever. And I get that, but I will say that like if the studios or if these companies got their way, what you would get is a crummier version of you would get the the AI Game of Thrones, you would get, which isn't good, and you would get the AI Scarlett Johansson, that would just be Uncanny Valley. We would not like it. I think long term it would be cheaper and the Netflix folks would make more money or whatever, but we don't want this to happen, I think, right?
Yeah. No, I agree.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Reminder, you could find us Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you get your shows. We upload every 2 weeks on Tuesday. You could find us here on the firm website as well. If you have any questions, you want to drop a line to myself or to Nessa. If you want to complain about my rigging the game against ChatGPT, or if you just want to know anything about these stories or have anything else you want to ask about regarding some stories we've covered in the past. Otherwise, we will talk to you in 2 weeks.